Today we're going to be covering Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, divided into two books in our Bibles, but actually one book. And I'll be laying some background for the rise of the monarchy in Israel before we go into the book of Samuel itself. And then I think this afternoon we might, at least according to schedule, we're supposed to finish with Samuel in the first hour of this afternoon. I don't know if we'll be able to do that. But if we do, we'll get started with 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to get focused on Kings. I'll say a few things about Chronicles, but in our look at the monarchy, I'm going to be primarily talking about 1st and 2nd Kings. I'm going to start before I go into the material on your notes, which begins with kingship in the Bible. I want to lay out a framework for understanding the sequence of the Old Testament. This is not the only way to think about how the Old Testament is put together as a whole, but it may be a helpful way to think about it. And I want to use what is called the offices of Christ. This is a concept that was developed in the early church. It plays a big role in some Protestant churches, especially in the Reformed branch of Protestantism, the Calvinist branch of Protestantism. Jesus is prophet, priest, and king, and that's how the person of Christ and the understanding of his work is organized. Those are the categories that are used to understand who he is. So I want to talk about those three categories, prophet, priest, and king, as a way of thinking about the development of Israel's history and the development of the Old Testament. But to do that, we have to change the order, because prophet, priest, and king, that works as a biblical order in certain respects, but I think the order of priest, king, prophet is actually a more helpful one to understand how the Old Testament is put together. What do I mean by that? What I'm getting at is you can see it simply by thinking about who are the most prominent leaders in Israel at different stages of Israel's life. When you think about the Mosaic era, obviously Moses is the chief of Israel, but he institutes, through the Lord reveals to him, a tabernacle system, the actual building, the tabernacle, the functioning of the sacrificial worship in the tabernacle, all the rules of the tabernacle. And when Moses dies, the official, the leader who is most prominent and represents Israel, is the high priest. The Mosaic covenant is a priestly covenant. There's a lot of attention to the liturgy of the tabernacle, a lot of attention to sacrifice, a lot of attention to qualifications for priesthood. And you don't yet have kings during the Mosaic era. You don't yet have Moses himself as a prophet, but you don't have prophetic ministry as a kind of established in the life of Israel. The Mosaic order is a priestly order. But that order basically dies at the end of the period of the Judges. The Mosaic order comes to an end in the early chapters of Samuel, symbolized by the destruction and the dismantling of the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the sanctuary of the Mosaic order, but the tabernacle is dismantled in the early chapters of Samuel, and it's never restored. Okay. We'll talk about that a bit more later this morning, but that's the end of a strictly Mosaic era. And after the destruction of the tabernacle, you have Samuel as a transitional figure, but he's initiating the monarchy period. And so from Saul and David on, until the exile, the most prominent leaders and officials in Israel are no longer the priests, but the kings. Priests are still there. The temple is a glorified form of the tabernacle, so there's still a sanctuary and there's sacrifices and there's still priestly activity. But you have a new institution, the monarchy, that comes into prominence, and the focus of attention in the history of Samuel and Kings are the kings in Israel and Judah. So we've moved from a priestly covenant in the Mosaic era to a royal covenant or kingly covenant in the Davidic era. And then that system also dies. It breaks down at the time of the exile, That's symbolized by the destruction of Solomon's temple. Nebuchadnezzar invades from Babylon. He destroys Jerusalem, burns down Jerusalem. He destroys the temple. The Davidic monarchy comes to an end at that point. There are still descendants of David around, but they're never restored to royal status. And in the latter part of the history of the Old Testament, prophets come into prominence in a way they haven't been before. Nearly all of the writing prophets in the Old Testament are writing in the latter part of the monarchy during the time of the exile and after the exile. So, for example, Isaiah, the first major prophetic writing, Isaiah is writing during the time of Hezekiah, Ahaz and Hezekiah. Hezekiah is one of the later kings of Judah, and that's when you have the beginning of this intense focus on prophecy. Jeremiah, as I mentioned yesterday, or 2 days ago, I guess, Jeremiah is prophesying at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. The Babylonians are actually invading. He's in Jerusalem at the time of the siege of Jerusalem. Ezekiel is in exile. He's prophesying from Babylon. Daniel is in exile. All the major prophets are either toward the end of the monarchy or during the exile. And the minor prophets also begin around the same period. You have the same kind of sequence. Micah is during the same time as Isaiah. And you have exilic prophets. You have post-exilic prophets like Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, who are all prophesying after Israel has returned from exile. So the focus of attention at the end of Israel's history in the Old Testament is on prophetic ministry. So the basic sequence is from priestly to royal to prophetic, priest, king, prophet, and then we come into the New Covenant, and Jesus summarizes all of these in one person. He's priest, king, and prophet in one. So we moved from these are overlapping stages. I'm not saying that priests exist all the way through. Prophets exist from the time of the monarchy on to the time of Jesus. But there's a focus of attention in these different periods, from priestly to kingly to prophetic, and then to Jesus. This may or may not be helpful. I'll suggest it, and you can take or leave it as you please. I think you can match up those phases of Israel's history with the different faces and appearances of the cherubim. The cherubim are four-faced angelic beings. We know that from Ezekiel. Ezekiel describes the cherubim in detail. When the glory cloud comes to Ezekiel, when he's by the river Kibar, I described this scene yesterday, I think. And he's able to see the cherubim up close. And what he sees are creatures that have a face of an ox or a bull, a face of a lion, a face of an eagle, and a face of a man. Ox, lion, eagle, man. Ox, lion, eagle, man. Ox, lion, eagle, man. Okay. Another thing that I've taught my kids. Ox, lion, and my grandkids now. I get my grandkids marching around the house. Ox, lion, eagle, man. Ox, lion, eagle, man. Okay. So those are the faces of the cherubim, and they kind of symbolize that sequence of priest, king, prophet, man. Priest, king, prophet, Jesus. The ox is the leading sacrificial animal in the priestly era. If you're a priest and you've committed a sin, you're offering a sin offering, you bring a bull, because the bull represents the priest. It's the most expensive and the most exalted animal. The king or the lion represents the king. David is the lion of the tribe of Judah, and kings are royal beasts, right? The lion is the king of the beasts. Prophets are symbolized by eagles. Prophets have the kind of far-sightedness. They see the whole landscape. They're caught up to heaven so that they can see the future. Eagles symbolize prophets. And then Jesus comes as the man. So that sequence from priest to king to prophet to man is symbolized by the sequence of the faces of the cherubim. Ox, lion, eagle, man. Ox, lion, eagle, ox, lion, eagle, man. Okay. And what that's in some ways that's just a kind of an aid to memory kind of organize your understanding of what's going on in the Old Testament. But I think it's also more than that, because what's happening in those phases of Israel's history is the maturation of Israel. Israel is growing up into full maturity. Israel reaches full maturity in Jesus. Jesus is the first, as one of my friends says, he's the first grown up in human history. He's the first fully formed human. And he comes to make fully formed human beings out of those who follow him. Okay? But he's priest, king, and prophet in himself. And that sequence from priest to king to prophet is a sequence of maturation. The priests are leading Israel in the infancy of Israel. Israel is under the law. They're under tight regulations. There's rules for everything in the tabernacle. There's rules for the sacrifices, very detailed rules. There's rules for cleanness and purity and impurity. The order of priesthood is an order designed for children in their childhood. As Israel matures, they mature into kingship. And they get a king, and they get kings who no longer, they meditate on the law day and night, but they meditate on the law in order to apply the law with wisdom. So as soon as Solomon gets wisdom from God, he's faced with this impossible situation with the two prostitutes and the babies. You remember that scene where the two prostitutes come, they've each had a baby. One of the babies has been killed during the night, and both of the women claim the child. Well, there's no law for deciding what actually happened. Solomon has to use wisdom, and he has to be cunning, he has to be shrewd in order to cut through the different stories and discover who actually is the mother. That's an act of royal wisdom. It's a sign of the maturation of Israel. And then the climax of Israel's maturation comes with the prophetic, with prophets. Prophets, they're meditating on the law. They have wisdom, but then they also given words, the words of God to speak. As God says to Jeremiah, the words that are put in Jeremiah's mouth have divine power. Jeremiah's words destroy and build up. Jeremiah's words uproot and plant. Those are the words of Yahweh, but they're spoken by Jeremiah, and they have divine power. And prophets are kind of the fully formed version of Israel in the Old Testament. And then Jesus comes summarizing all this, and again is the kind of the first grown-up in human history. So what's happening in the Old Testament is the Lord. Galatians 3 makes this. Paul makes this point in a simpler way than I'm developing. When he talks about the law as a tutor that led Israel to Christ, and he points out that when children are minors, that is, when they're small, they are no better than slaves. They're under rules. They don't have the freedom of the heir, but they are the heir. But they're under this tutelage of the law until they reach their majority, until they reach the maturity. And then they're free from the law, then they're fully mature, then they've reached their majority. That's the image that Paul uses to describe the transition from the Old to the New Testament. In the Old Testament, Israel was they were the heirs of God's promises, but they were heirs that were still children. But now in Christ, we've reached maturity. We're no longer children, and therefore we're no longer under those regulations of the law. So he's talking about he's summarizing the movement from the Old to the New Testament, Old to New Covenant, as a process of maturation. That's the kind of sequence that I'm describing in the move from priest to king to prophet to Jesus. One last point on that is that's a framework for understanding the Bible. Again, I emphasize not the only one. There are other ways to summarize what's happening through the Old Testament into the New, but I think that's a helpful way to just kind of grasp overall what's happening. But I think it's also a helpful way to grasp the maturation that you go through, that we all go through in life. We all go through a process that begins with a kind of priestly phase where we're under strict scrutiny and under the law. We grow up to become kings, ruling our own realms, having more freedom and having the challenge of addressing problems with wisdom, problems that are not in any rule book. But we're supposed to grow up to become prophetic Christians who have the power of God's word in us. You can think about this if you've ever learned to play a musical instrument. When you're learning to play a musical instrument, you start out clumsily. Your teacher gives you very strict rules about, if you're playing the piano, how to hold your fingers on the piano. My daughter learned to play the cello a couple years ago, how to hold your hand on the, what's that called, neck of the cello? I can't remember what it's called. And how to hold the bow. And it's awkward, and you have to, and the teacher's there saying, no, you got to do this, not that, this. And you're under close scrutiny, and there are a lot of rules to follow. You have to learn the rules. But eventually, you get to the point where the rules, you kind of have absorbed the rules. You don't have to refer to the rules anymore. When I sit down to play the piano, I took piano lessons for about 10 years in my childhood, my boyhood. When I sit down to play the piano, I don't anymore think about how to hold my fingers. And I don't have to translate the notes on the page into notes on the, I don't have to go through that process because there's an immediate recognition of the notes on the page matching the notes, the keys on the piano. I've moved from a kind of immature stage, which I'm calling a priestly stage, into mastery, a mastery of an instrument. I'm not master of the piano. I never really was, but I'm more master of the piano than I was when I started. Okay, and maybe some of you have learned to play a musical instrument or any other skill, and you've actually moved from that phase of immaturity, scrutiny, having to follow the rules very rigidly, to the point where you're free to actually do what you're supposed to do because the rules have become just part of you. And you can now play the musical, you can play the guitar, you can play the cello without having to think of the rules all the time about how you're doing it. That's a kingly phase of playing a musical instrument. But then when you get really good, you'll be able to teach other people how to do it. And you become a prophet who is helping people in the early stage to mature up to kings, and you want them to draw them up to be prophets. So I think that's the kind of sequence that we all go through in life. We all start out as children, hopefully with loving parents to guide us and to, they give us boundaries, they give us rules. They say, no, don't do that. You know, it's very much like the law. Do this, don't do that. Taste not, touch not. Okay. That's what parents say to their children. Don't touch that. That's what God was saying in Israel's infancy. Don't touch that. You'll become unclean. Don't taste that. You'll get sick. Okay. When you do that, you begin that way, but if your parents continue to instruct you, taste not, touch not, if they continue to give you strict boundaries when you're, 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, 20, something's wrong. Your parents have to release you, and you grow up into independent human beings. You haven't left those lessons behind, right? You've learned these priestly lessons, but now you become a king. You have your own life. You may have your own family, your own domain to rule, your own household. Maybe what you're aspiring to do is to be rulers, shepherds of a church. And a shepherd is a royal image in the Bible. Now you have a domain that you're given to rule. But you're not going to be good at that rule as a king in the church or the family or business or whatever unless you've absorbed the lessons of that priestly phase. You need to be a priest first, a servant first, and then you become a king. And then as you mature in kingship, you can enter the stage of prophetic ministry where you're not just, where you're ruling, but you're also guiding rulers and you're helping the priests to become kings, to become prophets. Okay. I hope that makes some sense. And I found that a really helpful paradigm for thinking about what's going on in the Bible and seeing how the whole sweep of the Bible really is depicting the maturation of the human race and the maturation of Israel as they move from their childhood through early adulthood into full maturity in Christ. So I say that as background because when the monarchy is introduced into Israel, that is a new thing in Israel. but it's anticipated. It's something that God planned for Israel. And it's a new stage of Israel's maturation as a people, moving from the Mosaic era without a king and with the tabernacle into a royal era with a king and with a temple and all the things that go with that. That is a new stage of maturation in Israel's history. Now I'm looking at the notes that you have for this first lecture on this lecture number 5 on 1st and 2nd Samuel. Against that background, I want to talk about kingship in the Bible. So I say Adam is created as priest in order to become king. That sequence from priest to king to prophet, I think, is already evident in the Garden of Eden. Adam is placed in the garden. He's told to guard the garden and to serve it. Those are the two verbs that are used in Genesis 2. Guard it and serve it. Shamar is guard in the Hebrew. Amad is serve. And those are terms that are predominantly used, especially when they're used together, to describe priestly ministry. The Levites guard and serve the tabernacle. The priests guard and serve the tabernacle. So Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden in order to be a priest in this garden setting, which is the original form of the sanctuary. Maybe you've covered this idea in the past, I don't know. But the Garden of Eden is, sometimes we think the Garden of Eden is kind of Adam and Eve's home, their place of residence. The garden within Eden, the garden is a portion of the land of Eden. It's east in Eden. The garden is a subset of the land of Eden, and it is the sanctuary. It's the place where Adam and Eve are to meet with God, as they do in Genesis 3. Okay, in that case, it goes badly because they've sinned. But the garden is the sanctuary where Adam is created and placed in order to be priest in that original sanctuary. Okay. But he's not supposed to be in that sanctuary, just be a priest forever. He's also supposed to become a king. He's supposed to have dominion over the earth. He's supposed to rule the earth and subdue it. He also has a kingly vocation. But his first task in Genesis 2 is to become priest. But I think we have a symbolic anticipation of his eventual elevation to kingship in the two trees that are placed in the center of the garden. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay. What do those represent? Well, the tree of life, I think, pretty clearly represents what it says. Life. And there is no restriction on the tree of life. You'll sometimes read that Adam was prohibited from eating the tree of life as well as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is not true. The only prohibition is of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which means he has access to the first tree and not to the second. He has access to one privilege, the privilege of life before God. That's a gift. He doesn't have to grow up or mature or do anything to receive the fruit of that tree. But the Lord sets another tree in the garden and prohibits him from having the fruit of that tree, at least for a time. And the traditional Reformed idea is that that's not a permanent prohibition. It's a probationary period. Adam is put in the garden and prohibited from eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But he will someday be allowed to eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He's given life. Someday he will grow up enough so that he can eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, what does that represent? If you trace out the phrase knowledge of good and evil in the Bible, you find that it's usually associated with two things. One, with kingship, and secondly, with mature wisdom. When Solomon asks for wisdom, 1 Kings 3, the Lord appears to him, I'll give you anything you ask for. And he asks for wisdom. And the wisdom he wants is the wisdom to judge, so he can rule this great people, which he describes as the wisdom to know good and evil. And the Lord grants him the wisdom to know good and evil. It's as if Solomon is given the fruit of the second tree, because he's now a king, and he has to have that. He has that fruit. He has that ability. He has that wisdom. David is also described a couple of times in Samuel as being like an angel of God, knowing good and evil. Knowledge of good and evil is not just knowing what's morally good and morally bad. Knowledge of good and evil in the Bible has to do with the wisdom of a king. So in Eden, Adam is given life as a gift, but he's to wait for a time until he's given this kingly privilege, this kingly wisdom of knowledge of good and evil. He has to grow in wisdom. I'd said the first thing that the knowledge of good and evil is associated with is royalty. The second thing is with mature wisdom, and that is particularly evident in Hebrews 5. Solid food is for the mature, who have their senses trained to discern good and evil. Milk is for the immature. Milk is for babies. Milk is for those who are just, that can't digest anything else. Milk is the diet of the immature. But solid food is for those who have matured to the point where they can discern good and evil. That's the same idea as you have in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So putting all these pieces together, I think what the situation in Eden is that Adam is created as a priest. That's his first task, a servant in God's house. But he's given the promise held out to him of being eventually admitted to kingship. He'll eventually be given the knowledge of good and evil, the wisdom to rule, to share in God's rule, to become a fully mature human being. Of course, Adam doesn't do that. Adam doesn't want to wait. Eve sees that the tree is good for food. It's good for granting wisdom. He can't wait to be king. Okay. You know the Lion King? Okay. Can't wait to be king. That's Adam. He just can't wait to be king. And so he takes the fruit that represents this higher privilege that he's not ready for. He seizes the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's a dimension of Adam's sin, is that impatience and that seizing of a privilege that he's not ready for. And because of that, he's cast out of the garden. But God's intention for humanity has always been to raise humanity from being servants to being sons, from being merely priests to being kings who rule with God. That is the destiny of the human race, realized in Jesus Christ, the God-man, who is in heavenly places, enthroned above all rule and authority and power and dominion, as the God-man, not just as God, but Jesus takes our humanity and is enthroned at the right hand of the Father. And as Yebtzega, I get the accent all right. Yebtzega said last night, we are united to him. We're united to Christ in his death, in his resurrection. We're in heavenly places with him, Ephesians 2:6 tells us. We're united to him in his reign as king, and that means that we have reached the level of maturity that Adam was offered but lost because he seized it before he was ready. Okay. So I think that's the background to everything the Bible says about kingship, that Adam is set up as a priest, but the promise of kingship is held out to him. God always wanted and still wants humanity to rule with him righteously over the creation. The point I was making was about the use of the phrase knowledge of good and evil and what it means in the Bible. If we just had that phrase in the abstract, thank you, it looks like it might appear to just refer to the ability to know what's good and bad. But if you look at 1 Kings 3, this is where the Lord is appearing to Solomon. And I'm going to break into Solomon's response to the Lord. Verse 7, "Now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king in the place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people who cannot be numbered and counted for multitude. So give thy servant an understanding heart, a knowing heart." What's the word? A hearing heart, that's what it is. A hearing heart to judge thy people, to discern good and evil. And discern there is just the verb know, to know good and evil. That's the kind of wisdom that Solomon is asking for. It's a royal wisdom that includes wisdom to judge and to rule the people. And I think that's the significance of the phrase already in Genesis. It refers to that kind of royal wisdom that Adam is promised but is not yet ready to receive. So with that background, then humanity as a whole is intended to be raised up to kingship. Israel is the new human race, right? God started the human race with Adam. He restarted the human race 10 generations later with Noah. He restarts the human race after the fall at Babel from within the human race with Abraham. Abraham is supposed to be the father of Israel, but he's a new Noah, he's a new Adam. He's the one through whom God is going to realize his intentions for the human race. The children of Abraham are going to be priests and kings to God. That's why Abraham is chosen, so that in Abraham's seed, the vocation of Adam, the vocation of humanity, can be realized. So Israel is a new Adamic people. Israel is not just chosen to bring salvation in the sense of deliverance from sin and restoration to communion with God. That's true. But Israel is chosen in order to be God's means for bringing humanity to its destined end, the end that was destined already when Adam was created. Okay. So it makes sense, if that's true, if Israel is the new human race in the new Adamic race, it makes sense that Israel would be destined to be a royal people. And that's exactly what the Lord tells Abraham on more than one occasion, predominantly in Genesis 17. This is the Covenant of Circumcision. God is reiterating his promises. Abraham reiterating his promise to make him a great nation. And then verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. Of course, Abraham is 99 years old, has no children. His wife is old and barren. She doesn't look like she's going to be able to bear children. But the Lord's promise is, I will make of you a great nation, make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. And then verses 15 and 16, God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarah, but Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, indeed I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Okay. So I think that's part of what Abraham is going to be shown the stars of the heaven. That's in this same passage. Abraham is shown the stars of heaven. And he says, so shall your seed be. Your seed is going to be like the stars of heaven. What does that mean? Lots of stars, right? Uncountable number of stars. That's how many descendants Abraham will have. An uncountable multitude. But it's not just that there are a lot of stars. It's where stars are. Stars are in heaven. Stars are light that shine in the night. Stars are among the rulers of the night. The moon and the stars rule the night, according to the creation account. When the Lord tells Abraham, your children will be like stars, he's saying, you're going to have as many children as there are stars, and your children, your sons, are going to be like kings and queens shining in darkness. They're going to fill the sky. Kings shall come from you. Okay. So Abraham's children are destined to be a royal people. And that takes form in one tribe, Judah. Eventually, let me point that out, and then I want to elaborate on that. I talked about this yesterday, the promise to Judah in Genesis 49. Judah, this 49:8, Judah, your brothers shall praise you, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp, the lion associated with kingship. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion who does rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to whom shall be the obedience of the peoples. Judah is going to be the royal tribe. So all the way back in the time of Jacob, at the time of Abraham already, God is telling Abraham, your children will be kings. Jacob says, Judah, your children are going to be kings. Deuteronomy 17, we talked about briefly yesterday, and Deuteronomy 17 says, when you enter the land and you want to have a king, then this is the way the king should behave. But the Deuteronomy 17 assumes that Israel is going to have kings. Israel is a royal race, and particularly the tribe of Judah within Israel is a royal tribe. But one of the interesting twists on interesting developments in Israel, in Israel's history. Judah is the royal tribe. After the exile, the exiles come back to the land, and they are all called Judahites. The word Jew in Hebrew is just the word Judahites. Okay. Jew is a contraction of the name Judah. All the Israelites who come back from exile are treated as if they are members of the royal tribe. So you have one tribe that's a royal tribe, but after the exile, you have this expansion of royal privilege, and it's as if every Jew, every descendant of Abraham, every child of Abraham, is part of the royal tribe. They're all Judahites. And that flows into the new covenant, of course, where all of us in Christ is the king. He shares his priesthood, his kingship, and his prophetic spirit with us so that we can be priests, kings, and prophets in him. All of us are kings and priests to God. Okay. And that's always been God's intention. And I'm belaboring this partly because some people will argue from passages from the book of Judges or passages like 1 Samuel 8 that kingship is a deviation from God's purposes for Israel. I don't think that's the case, given what we find out in Genesis and from the story of Adam, the calling of Adam on, and the promise to Abraham on. Israel is supposed to be a royal people. But 1 Samuel 8 does give us cautions. I'll read a bit of this and explain what I think is happening here. Begin with verse 1, 1 Samuel 8. It came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. And the name of the first one was Joel, and the name of the second Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. Beersheba is all the way to the south of the land. From Dan to Beersheba. That's an expression that's used from the upper regions, the far north to the far south. Beersheba is the far south. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. So Samuel's sons are not following his habits and his way of ruling Israel. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up to the land of Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the custom of the king who will reign over them." Now, I'll come back and look at how Samuel describes the custom of the king. So the situation, Samuel's sons are his successors in guiding Israel, but they're not faithful. And so the elders of Israel ask Samuel to give a king. The Lord and Samuel both see this as a rejection of the Lord's kingship. And the Lord, in fact, compares this to what Israel has been doing from the beginning of their exit from their exodus from Egypt. They've always been turning to other gods, and now they're doing the same thing again. He's referring to the history that we looked at in Judges yesterday, where Israel was continually turning to other gods the gods of the nations that surrounded them, and serving them, and the Lord gave them over to the nations whose gods they served. And the Lord says they're doing the same thing again. They're rejecting me as their king, and they're looking for other gods. In this case, the God seems to be a king. So in the book of Judges, they're turning to Baal, or they're turning to Molech, or some other god as a deliverer. Now, they're turning to a human deliverer, a human savior, but it's just another form of idolatry. It's a political form of idolatry now. So there's a continuity the Lord sees between Israel's rejection of him as king during the period of the Judges and their rejection of him as king now in the days of Samuel, which is still in the late part of the period of the Judges. How do we understand that against the background of what I just said? It's clear from Deuteronomy that Israel is supposed to have a king. In fact, Deuteronomy says, when you say, let us have a king like the nations, in Deuteronomy 17, that phrase, let's have a king like the nations, is not seen as a bad thing. It just means all the other nations have kings, we want a king too. And the instructions are, yeah, that's fine, you can have a king, only this is the kind of king you need to have. You can't do these things. But in this case, wanting a king like the nations is wanting to be like the nations, wanting to have a king who acts like the kings of the nations. So I think the wrong here is not in asking for a king per se. That's not Israel's failure here. The failure is in asking for a king not to implement and represent Yahweh's kingship, but as an alternative to Yahweh's kingship. They're asking for a king in an idolatrous way. But the fact that they're getting a king is itself something that God had planned for from the beginning. So even though there's a kind of sinful origin to kingship in Samuel, it's still in the larger plan of God. This was always intended for Israel, that they would have a king just as the nations have kings. Something flitted through my head there that I wanted to say. Maybe it'll come back to me. So then beginning of verse 10 of 1 Samuel 8, Samuel is going to describe the custom of the king. You want a king like the nations, the people say. The Lord says to the people. You want a king like the nations? Okay, I'll give you a king just like the kings of the nations. That reminds me of what I was going to say. In a lot of I mentioned this yesterday, in a lot of ancient civilizations and polities, kingship was a sacred and divine institution. Babylonian kings thought that the crown, and I don't know if they had crowns, but whatever symbols of kingship that they possessed descended from heaven, from the gods. Kingship directly comes from heaven, and it's given to the kings of Babylon. 1 Samuel shows the sinful origins of kingship in Israel. Even though God intended for them to have a king, the actual request for a king is a sinful one. And there's a stark contrast between the ideas that ancient civilizations had about the origins of kingship and what's being said about the origins of kingship here. It's not only a human origin, but it's a human origin that's actually sinful. Okay? So there's already a kind of caution about kingship in the origins. And then Samuel's going to describe the custom of the king. So Samuel spoke to all these words of the Lord to the people. This is the custom of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in chariots and among his horsemen. They will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, of 50s, and some to do his plowing and reap his harvest and make his weapons of war and his equipment for chariots. He will take your daughters for perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and will give them to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flock, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out on the day because of the Lord your God, because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you on that day. Okay. So take. That's what the king does. That's what the king's going to do. So you take your sons, make them soldiers. You can take your daughters, make them bakers in his court. He's going to take your flocks and your herds and your fields. He's going to confiscate your fields to reward his favorites. He is going to take 1/10 of the produce of your fields and 1/10 of your flocks. The 1/10 belongs to the Lord. The tithe is the Lord's, but the king is now going to claim kind of a divine, he's going to assert a divine claim on the produce of Israel's land and take 1/10 of what they produce. This is the kind of kingship that, according to Samuel, Israel is going to end up with. And in a number of respects, this is exactly the kind of king they get in Saul. Saul does many of these things. There are a couple of hints later in 1 Samuel that Saul has rewarded his closest allies by confiscating from other Israelites and helping his close allies. So he's taking and taking and taking. Eventually, you have other kings in Israel's history who do the same. So notice the end of that. What I was reading there, verse 18. You'll cry out on that day. So the sequence is again like the sequence of the judges. You're turning from the Lord and going after an idol. In this case, the idol is a king. You'll be oppressed by this king as you're oppressed by the foreign nations in Judges. You'll cry out to me when you're oppressed by the king, but I won't hear. Okay, that's pretty scary. The Lord is going to close his ears to Israel's cry because they're rejecting his kingship. Okay, so those are the origins of kingship, and it's a sinful origin. Israel is sinning in asking for a king. They don't need to have a king to accomplish what they say. Samuel's sons are unfaithful, but Samuel's sons are in Beersheba, which is way down in the south. They're not in the center of the land, they're not in the main territories of the land. It appears that Samuel knew that they were unfaithful and kind of put them down to where they do the least damage. But in any case, that's the origin of the kingdom in Israel's history, but that's overshadowed or overridden by the fact that God intended Israel to be a royal people from the start. Okay. With the kingdom come a number of political and other kind of innovations. So this is a new phase of Israel's history. We're moving out of the Mosaic phase. The Mosaic phase is dying, and we're having a new birth of Israel as a royal people. And with the kingship come a number of major shifts in political and liturgical organization. So there's obviously, if you have a king, you have a centralization of power. You have a capital city. During the time of the judges, you never had judges ruled in areas of Israel. You never had a judge that ruled the entire land, and they weren't permanent. They didn't establish a succession. Saul is going to rule all the tribes, and at least theoretically, he's intending to establish a succession. That doesn't happen, in fact, but David does. And then David captures Jerusalem as his capital city, and that Jerusalem becomes the center of political power. You still have all the tribal areas in Israel that are functioning somewhat independently. They have elders of each tribe that have decision-making power in their tribal areas. But they're overarching that is the power of the king. Okay. You can see this partly in the centralization of military power. Right? None of the judges had a standing army. They would call up the people to fight when it was needed, and it's a citizen army. The people would be called on to defend their own land. You didn't have a professional army. But David and Solomon and the other kings all centralized military power. Okay. That's a change in Israel's political life. Another change has to do with the temple. We'll look at this when we get to 1st, 2nd Kings. So I won't say much about it, but we have the establishment of the temple as a permanent, settled sanctuary. And this is linked to the centralization of political power, because the king has his palace in Jerusalem, Solomon does, right next to the temple, which is Yahweh's palace in Jerusalem. Political and priestly power are concentrated in the one city. Another important change is in the Davidic covenant, where the Davidic king becomes the embodiment, the personification of Israel. We'll look at that later today. A prophecy begins during the time of the kings. In Samuel, we're told that before the time of Samuel, prophets were called seers. But then at a later point, they become known as prophets. The word prophet is used a few times prior to that. But prophets begin to arise during the time of the monarchy. And prophets are linked to the monarchy. The prophets are God's spokesman to keep the kings in check, to warn them about following the customs, the custom of the king as Samuel lays it out, to warn them and to rebuke them when they disobey God and they break the covenant. Okay, so prophecy becomes a phenomenon. We'll talk about that when we talk about kings. One last thing that I didn't put on your notes, but is really, I think, important. Let me back up and set it up by going back to the call of Abraham. Abraham is called to separate himself from Ur. He becomes a separate people. But right from the beginning, he's separated in order to be a redemptive influence on the Gentiles. Abraham is not separated, and Israel is not separated for their own sake. Israel is separated so they can be a faithful, holy people to bring the worship of God and the good news to the Gentiles. That's their mission. Israel is a missional people. And that mission of serving the Gentiles and allying with the Gentiles, joining with the Gentiles in the worship of the true God, comes to prominence during the monarchy. When Solomon builds the temple, he gets the cooperation of Hiram, king of Tyre, who provides him with materials and craftsmen. The craftsmen of Tyre are the best in woodworking and other kinds of skill. Hiram provides cedar, the cedar wood that's the paneling inside the temple. That comes from Tyre. So you have a Gentile who is a sponsor and an assistant in the building of the temple. The temple is Israel. It's the house of God in Israel. Israel's the priestly people maintaining the temple, but it is a house of prayer for all nations, built by both Jews and Gentiles. And then, of course, when Solomon, at the height of Solomon's reign, you have reputedly the Ethiopian queen of Sheba. I'm not sure she came from Ethiopia, but just for the sake of context, I'll say the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon, brings treasure, comes with an entourage, and she has no breath in her. 1 King says when she sees Solomon's wisdom and the temple and his palaces and the order and beauty of the service at his table. She has a state dinner in Jerusalem, and she can't believe how everything is so perfectly choreographed at this state dinner. The wisdom of God is manifest in everything Solomon does, and that becomes a magnet for Gentile rulers like the Queen of Sheba. And we know there's scattered hints that Solomon has other kinds of contacts with Gentiles. He builds ships. You don't have a lot of sailors in the Old Testament. So interesting shift from the Old to the New Testament. All the Old Testament leaders are shepherds, and then you get to the New Testament, the apostles are fishermen, from land to sea. That's an interesting shift. But Solomon is one of the few who builds ships and goes on trading ventures, and he comes back with ivory and peacocks and baboons and all kinds of other products from who knows where. They're going to India, maybe. Definitely going to Africa, trading with Africa. Kings come from all over the place in order to gain the wisdom from Solomon. That's the story of the Queen of Sheba, as I understand it. The legend about the Queen of Sheba being an Ethiopian coming to Solomon in order to learn about statecraft, in order to learn how to rule well. That's why she visits. So you have this expanded influence of Israel to the Gentiles. And that's an important thing to notice, because there is a kind of vague impression that in the Old Testament, God was only concerned with Israel, and there weren't any people outside of Israel who knew anything about the living God, the true God. And Israel was kind of isolated and ingrown, and that was what the whole Old Testament was supposed to be like. It's not what it was supposed to be like, and that's not the case. It's not true, especially during the early period of the kingship. You have the expansion of the knowledge of God, the expansion of the wisdom of God through Solomon to the nations. And then think about what, I take that a step further. Think about what happens at the exile. Okay? The exile is a judgment on Israel. Israel gets scattered among the nations. So at the time of the exile, you have Jews going out to Babylon. Some of the Jews go down to Egypt and establish a very long-lasting Jewish community in Egypt that includes there's a temple built in Egypt, a Jewish temple built in Egypt. Apparently, they were scattered up into Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. They're scattered to Greece. By the time Paul comes around in the first century, there are Jews in Rome. I mean, who knows how far the Jews scattered? They were all over at least the eastern Mediterranean, maybe further. And that's a judgment because they're out of the land. But that's also a blessing. It's like the Levites. They're judged by being scattered through the land, but that becomes a blessing for Israel because you got a Levite living next door. The Council of Jerusalem says Moses is heard in every city. There's a Jewish synagogue in every town that Paul visits. There's a Jewish synagogue. So even before and those were already there. Those didn't start in the first century. Those were already there for perhaps a couple of centuries by the time Paul visits them. So that's still under the Old Testament system. You not only have the expansion of Israel's mission to the Gentiles under Solomon, but you have an even greater expansion during the time of the exile. Okay? Because now they're scattered everywhere. And that's all, it's a trajectory that leads up to the New Testament where, we're sent out everywhere. Go to the ends of the earth. But that's already beginning in the Old Testament. There's not a huge discontinuity between an enclosed, self-enclosed, isolated Israel in the Old Testament and then suddenly expanding. Israel is separated in order to serve the Gentiles, and they do that in smaller forms until you get to the New Covenant when you have the Spirit comes and you have this great expansion, worldwide expansion of the gospel. Let me say a few things about the ordering of Samuel as a whole. First of all, as I said, it's a single book. It's divided in two, apparently, because just for practical reasons. The original texts would have been on scrolls, and if you have the entirety of 1st and 2nd Samuel on a scroll, it becomes really unwieldy, hard to pick up. 1st and 2nd Samuel are divided at the death of Saul. There's two accounts of the death of Saul, one at the end of 1 Samuel, the other at the beginning of 2 Samuel. Again, as there are no chapter divisions, you shouldn't read that as a division in the book. So if you want to get the flow of the narrative, you need to ignore the book division and read them as a single volume. The same thing is true of Kings, same thing is true of Chronicles. All of those are single books that are divided, again, probably for practical reasons. As a single book, it has a coherence in a couple of ways. One of the things that joins the whole book together is I talked yesterday about looking at the beginning and end of biblical books as a way of getting a feel for the arc of the entire book, the story arc for narrative, or the arc of the arguments in an epistle or something. So what's at the beginning and end of 1st and 2nd Samuel? Samuel's birth is the very beginning of Samuel, but then within a few chapters, you have the Philistine attack on the tabernacle, the Philistine capture of the ark, the death of Eli the high priest, the death of his two sons. So the priesthood is decimated. The tabernacle is robbed of its main piece of furniture, the ark. And the tabernacle, as I've said a couple of times, the tabernacle is never put back together again. The ark never returns to the Mosaic Tabernacle after this. The ark goes to various places. You can follow it if you search for the Ark of the Covenant in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It ends up at different places. Eventually, David brings it into Jerusalem. But when he brings it to Jerusalem, the rest of the Mosaic Tabernacle is not in Jerusalem. The rest of the Mosaic Tabernacle into the early years of Solomon, the Mosaic Tabernacle without the ark is in a different place. That's at the beginning of 1 Kings 3. I'm not remembering where it is exactly. So the king went up to Gibeon to sacrifice there. Gibeon, that was the great high place. Gibeon is where the Mosaic Tabernacle with the altar, probably the lampstand and the table of showbread, the altar of incense, but not the Ark of the Covenant. That's in Gibeon. The Ark of the Covenant is in a separate tent that David sets up for it in Jerusalem. So once the house at Shiloh is plundered by the Philistines, it's dismantled and never restored. And it's not restored that dismantling happens during Samuel's early life, before Saul becomes king. Saul reigns for 40 years. The tabernacle is not put back together. David reigns for 40 more years. The tabernacle is still not put back together. And the ark doesn't rejoin all the rest of the tabernacle furniture until it all goes into the temple. And that's in the early years of Solomon. Okay, so you have 100 years or so of a disrupted sanctuary. Okay, and that starts at the beginning of 1 Samuel. You have the disrupted house and the dismantled house. 1 Samuel 4 through 6. That's the story of the ark, and the ark eventually returns to the land after it's in Philistia for a while, but it's not put back in the tabernacle. Then you turn to the end of 2 Samuel, and you have the story of the plague that is running through Israel. And David asks the Lord, David is given a choice, actually, about what kind of punishment. This is for David's census. That I should have started there. David takes a census of the people, and the Lord is angry with him taking a census. And so the Lord says, I'll give you choices about what kind of punishment I'm going to bring. Do you want famine? Do you want invasion? Do you want pestilence? He chooses pestilence because he wants to be in the Lord's hands. The Lord is more merciful than any invaders are going to be. So he chooses a pestilence, and there's pestilence raging throughout the land. And the pestilence ends when David offers sacrifice on a threshing floor that he purchases from Araunah the Jebusite. Jebus is the early name of Jerusalem. So this is a threshing floor in the city of Jerusalem that David purchases, sets up an altar, offers a sacrifice, and the Lord responds to that sacrifice and ends the plague. And that's the end of 2 Samuel. The last verse of 2 Samuel, David built an altar there to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Thus the Lord was moved by entreaty for the land, and the plague was held back for Israel. So this is kind of an odd ending. Why end on that episode Why end with this act of David? Why not end with something more memorable? You know, he's basically the last chapter of the last bit of the last chapter of 2 Samuel is basically a real estate deal. If you're writing an adventure story about David the king, would you end with him with a purchase of property? That's an odd way to end the book. But it fits with the earlier part of the book, because what David is purchasing, the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, becomes the site of the temple. He's purchasing the plot on which Solomon will later build the temple. So we find that out in 2 Chronicles 3, just so you have proof that I'm not lying to you. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place where David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. It's an alternative version of Araunah's name, but it's the same. That is the threshing floor that David purchases at the end of 2 Samuel. So the arc of the overall arc, if you look at the beginning of 1 Samuel to the end of 2 Samuel, the overarching story is the story of the house of God. It's about the dismantling of the house in the battle with the Philistines, and eventually, and then the whole time when the house is divided, eventually it ends with David purchasing the property on which the temple will be built and the house of God will be reunited. The temple isn't yet built there. David doesn't do that, of course, but the property is bought, and David is going to be preparing for that. So that's one way to look at the overall arc and structure of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Another way to look at it, and another way to see that it's a unified book, is to look at the use and placement of poetry in 1st and 2nd Samuel. There's a poem, a poetic prayer of Hannah at the beginning of the book. Hannah is a barren woman who prays for a son. That son is Samuel. That's how the book begins. Okay. Just a little preaching note. 1st and 2nd Samuel is about a major transition in Israel's history, major political changes and upheavals. It starts with the prayer of a barren woman. Okay. And then Samuel is the agent for preparing for the monarchy and for anointing David. All these huge world-changing political events are initiated by the prayer of a barren woman. As it's often the case in the Bible, right? A barren woman gets pregnant and the world changes. It seems like it's such a trivial thing. A woman who would be utterly forgotten to history if the Bible had recorded her, and yet she's key to this great change. So you have that poem. I'll read that in a second. You have that poem at the beginning. Right in the middle of the book, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, after the second account of Saul's death. The first account is the narrator's account, which I think is the accurate account. That's in 1 Samuel 31. 2 Samuel 1, we have David interrogating is he an Amalekite? Suddenly I can't remember where he's from. Anyway, there's a man comes to David and claims to have killed Saul. I think he's lying. And David executes him because he shouldn't be killing the king. So those two accounts, and then right after that, you have David's lament for Saul. Yeah. I'll come back to this point later, but that's the second poem. That's right in the middle of the book. But notice David's heart here. Most of the time that David and Saul have been in contact, David's been running away from Saul, and Saul's been chasing him, trying to kill him. But when Saul dies, David honors him and laments over his death, and especially laments Saul's son, Jonathan. But he also laments over Saul. So those are the first two, and then in chapters 22 and 23, we have the last of the poems. Chapter 22 is a slightly altered version of Psalm 18. It's basically the same psalm with a couple of very small detailed changes, differences. And then the beginning of chapter 23 is a poem that's described as the last words of David. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But those three poetic passages, Hannah's prayer, David's lament over Saul and Jonathan, and the psalm and the last words of David in 2 Samuel 22 and 23, those mark out the beginning, the middle, and the end of the book. Okay? So the poems are a structural feature. They're also thematic, and I'll give you a break after I go through a couple of these poems.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's right.
Someone wants to do some maintenance in your room.
Okay.
Do you mind if I let them?
That's fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah. So the poems are not only structurally important, but they're thematic. Hannah's prayer is a prayer in response. She prays for a son, and the Lord answers her prayer. And her prayer in 1 Samuel 2 is her praise to God for the answer to the prayer. But as I read this, notice what she thinks of the. Notice how she expresses the effects of her son's birth. That was a convoluted way to say it. She's not just celebrating the fact that she now has a child. That's a great joy to her. But she knows that her child is a part of a turning point in Israel's history. So this is Hannah's prayer. My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation. I mean, at one level, she's just talking about, I've been saved from the shame of barrenness. And her enemy has been her rival wife. Her husband, Elkanah, has two wives. The other wife has children, Hannah doesn't. And now Hannah's a child, and so the Lord has vindicated her against her enemy. But there's much more than that in her mind. There's no one holy like the Lord, and there's no one besides thee, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hired themselves out for bread, and those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, and she who has many children languishes. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust, lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Okay. So this, again, is a praise for the birth of a son. The Lord opened her womb and she's rejoicing. But she sees that event in her own life as an expression and revelation of the kind of God she serves and worships. A God who raises up those who are poor, a God who topples the people from high places, a God who shatters the bows of the mighty and strengthens the feeble. Okay, so she's seeing this in her own life. There's been this reversal of fortune. She's been mocked by the other wife. She's been shamed because of her barrenness. Now she's being exalted. But she sees this as a sign of what God is going to do in Israel, which is what's happening throughout Samuel. Okay. Just a few chapters later, there's going to be a noble that's going to be toppled from his seat, quite literally toppled from his seat. When Eli hears that the ark is captured, he's going to fall off his seat and break his neck and die. Hophni and Phinehas are prominent men in Israel. They're priests. They're going to die. People who are high up are going to be cast down, and the Lord is going to exalt eventually David, Samuel, the son of lowly Hannah, going to exalt him, and then eventually exalt David. And so this Hannah's prayer and her experience are emblematic of what's going to happen through the whole book. Obvious question, but did that poem remind you, or that song remind you of any other song in the Bible? Right. Brian was right. Hannah's song is very closely parallel to Mary's song in Luke 1. I want to look briefly at the last of the poems, which is the last words of David. So Hannah's psalm of praise is setting us up. It's structurally important, but it's also setting up some of the themes of 1st and 2nd Samuel. David's poem at the end is also highlighting some key themes, and especially key themes about kingship. There's some beautiful lines here about the nature of just and godly rule. So let me read the first 7 verses of 2 Samuel 23. These are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, declares, and the man who was raised on high declares, the anointed of the God of Jacob and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God, is as the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, when the tender grass springs out of the earth through sunshine after rain. Truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me, ordered in all things and secured. For all my salvation and all my desire will he not indeed make it grow? But the worthless, every one of them will be thrust away like thorns, because they cannot be taken in hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned in the fire in their place. Okay. Lots of things, interesting things to talk about in the poem, but I want to highlight the last part of verse 3 and then verse 4. These are the words of the Lord to David the king. Description of what just rule in the fear of the Lord looks like. And it uses a simile. It's like the light of the morning. A good king is like light shining on the land. Light that makes the land fertile. I mean, without light, nothing grows. That's what a ruler is like. If you have a ruler like Samuel describes in 1 Samuel 8, who continually takes, he's not acting like a light over the land. He's confiscating what the land produces rather than making it more fertile and making it flourish. But a good ruler is like, Calvin says this, good rulers are as necessary to the health and the prosperity of a people as sunshine and rain are to the growth of plants. Good rulers are like light. But I think that's part of the image. One who rules justly is like light, but it's specifically light in the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, through sunshine after rain. Okay. It's not just light that's making the grass grow and the plants grow and flourish, but it's light that, it's like sunshine after rain, which, this is not exactly the image, but Birmingham, Alabama, where I live, is a fairly temperate climate. We don't get a lot of snow. We don't get a lot of frost. But occasionally in the morning, there's frost on my front lawn, and the sun rising over the front lawn, and the grass looks jeweled, sparkles. And it's not just sparkling like white light, but it's refracted. You got the frost acts like a prism. So you got these kind of rainbow colors. It's just grass. Kind of grass, grass is, I cut my grass and I throw it into the woods. Grass lives for a day and then it's cut down, it's burned. But it's glorified. It's glorified by the frost and the light. And I think that's the image that we have here. A king who rules with justice doesn't just make his land flourish, but he makes his land sparkle. He glorifies the land. He makes the land reflect the light that he shines on it. Okay. David is talking about political rulers, and I'm sure you all share the feeling that this is a very rare kind of ruler. I don't think we have many of them in my country. Rulers that are like lights, that glorify and make the land flourish. I suspect that you have felt the same. I know that in your not too distant history, you have had kings much more like the king in 1 Samuel 8, confiscate and kill. This is the kind of king we long for, kind of rulers we long for. Rulers who rule in the fear of the Lord. The other important application to make, though, is to your future as future shepherds of the people of God. I said this briefly yesterday, I guess, but the image of shepherd in the Bible is a royal image. Kings are shepherds. So when you're installed into pastoral ministry, you have priestly duties, you have prophetic duties, as it were, but you're a shepherd, and that means you're a king. You're ruling a people. And this is the kind of rule that you aspire to. You want to make your people flourish. You want to be a light that makes them grow. You don't want to be the kind of shepherd. There are shepherds like these. I don't know. Somebody might say Joel Osteen is a shepherd like this, who kind of absorbs all the light to himself. Becomes a celebrity pastor. You want to shine the light on your people so they flourish. So they're like the grass after the rain in the sunshine. Okay? You want them to grow and mature. You don't want to protect your position. Now this may not feel like a real temptation, but it is. I mean, you've got a status in the church. You want people to respect you, people to listen to you. And they should. They really should. But our motivation and our aim as shepherds of the people of God has to be exactly this: to be a light, shining Christ's light, so that the people flourish like grass through grass that's lit up and glorified by the sunshine. All right.